The EQ Edge, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Dr. Stein. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the chat box. We will be answering questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as they follow up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today's presenter is Dr. Stein. He is a clinical psychologist and an expert on emotional intelligence. Steve is also the founder and CEO of Multi-Health Systems. He is the co-author of the international bestseller, The EQ Edge, Emotional Intelligence and Your Success, as well as the Emotional Intelligence Skills Assessment. He is here with us today to share his findings. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon to everyone for whom it's afternoon, and good day for everyone else. It's great to be here with you all to be talking about one of my favorite topics, the topic of emotional intelligence. And what I'd like to start with in terms of the discussion is the application of emotional intelligence in a number of aspects of the workplace. And where I'd like to start specifically is trying to answer the question of what it means to be smart in today's organizations. We've defined being smart in a number of different ways over the years, and what I want to do is focus on this particular way that we'll be looking at today and what that means in terms of being smart. And I'd like to start the conversation with the area of leadership, because a lot of the time I'm spending with organizations today starts with issues or concerns around what's happening at the top of the organization or leadership in the organization. So we'll start with that, but leadership could be at a number of different levels in an organization. Anyone who has one or more people reporting to them for our purposes today can be considered a leadership. And many of the skills that we value or need to be successful as leaders are skills that serve us well in almost any aspect of the kinds of work that we do. So let me start with the very beginning of that. When we select our leaders, just as when we select other people to work in our organizations, there's usually very specific characteristics that we focus on the people that we want either to lead us or to work with us in any capacity. And the criteria that we look for seem to be pretty standard in most organizations I visit around the world. We often start off with academic credentials. What's the educational background of the individual? How well do they do in school? So there's usually a big focus on academics, grades, and so on. And then we go into background, experience, resume. What has this person done before? And again, in leadership positions, we look at, have they led other groups, and how many years have they done this particular kind of work versus that particular kind of work, and how might that contribute to the position that we're looking at now. And thirdly, we look at technical skills, and this can vary depending on the industry or the area that we're looking at. But these can be accounting skills, sales skills, legal skills, any number of technical skills that go into the mix. Generally, these are kind of the three big areas that tend to get focused on when we look or select our leaders, but there's also a fourth that sometimes gets looked into, and that's personality. We often, will ask the question of what this person might be like to work with in that capacity. How might they project themselves? How might they deal with other people? And it's not always a very formal area where they actually test for this, but at least most of the time some attention is paid to it. So those are the areas that many of the organizations that I get to visit focus on when trying to select the best people for their organizations. It usually stops at around there. And a lot of the attention seems to be on what we call being smart, or IQ aspect, intelligence aspect of smart, the traditional intelligence, being analytic, logical, rational abilities, And also, looking at the way in which we learn to reason and solve problems using our backgrounds, technical skills, and things that we've learned previously. This is, traditionally in psychology we talk about these as cognitive abilities or cognitive skills. Interestingly, if I do my little evolution of intelligence, this is what we tend to find. If I think you can see my little mouse there, but this is where we've sort of striven to in our society. The sort of ultimate is being very technically savvy in terms of the kinds of people that we look for in organizations, or what we look for in terms of intelligence. But if we step back a few generations to this part of our grandparents, our great-great-grandparents' history, being intelligent at that time, the kinds of things that meant being intelligent were quite different from the things that we don't look at now. So being intelligent back then, and I hope you see what I'm showing, which is this evolution of intelligence. Being intelligent back then meant if you were walking through a jungle, for example, and you saw a dangerous animal, you wouldn't be, hopefully, very analytic and standing there and saying, gee, I wonder what species that lion is, and I wonder if it's a male or a female. Because if you were analytic about it, chances are you'd be eaten for lunch. You wouldn't survive, and as a species, we wouldn't have survived. We would have been decimated. So being intelligent back then meant using a different part of the brain, the lower parts of the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, where we'd be able to recognize a danger and react quickly to run, hopefully in this case, and save ourselves. So being intelligent was a very, very different function in terms of how we looked at it. It wasn't so much analytical. It was analytical to a degree, but not frontal lobe analytical, the kinds of things that we really look for in positions today. So the ultimate that we've sort of aspired to, and this is with respect to, I guess, Leonard Nimoy, as you all know, just passed away recently, but I use his character, Spock, as an example of a kind of intelligence that our society has really striven towards, the ideal being someone who's purely logical, rational, and devoid of emotion, because we've been taught to believe, most of us, that emotion gets in the way of good decision making and sort of doing things right, and we don't look very kindly on emotion. In fact, we don't treat emotion seriously at all, and we tend to dismiss people who are overly emotional in the workplace or in other places, don't pay attention to them. So we've never really considered that maybe emotion could be more balanced or nuanced or have more of a purpose that we could use to our advantage. But we've done, over the last several hundred years, we've sort of drawn these dichotomies between being rational and being emotional. And you'll see this in literature, in many aspects of life. If we go to Shakespeare and some of the characters that he described in his plays, you'd see those who are sort of more logical and rational, and we admire those, and those who are more emotional are the ones that, of course, we want to get rid of or get out of the way. But the reality is, if we stay with our Spock analogy, when it comes to the captain of the ship, at least the Starship Enterprise, it was James Kirk who was our captain. And interestingly, there was William Shatner wrote in his biography, described sort of the transition of that role, how he transitioned it from what it originally was in the original Roddenberry transcript or book. The original Captain Kirk was described as the smartest person in Starship University. He was a valedictorian. He was actually described as a textbook with legs. But when William Shatner actually read for the role and studied the script and the character, he, according to his biography, suggested changing that character because he believed in his gut that that's not the way a leader really is. The leader isn't the smartest one in the room. The leader is, as I have here in quotes, as he described it, a man with very human emotions. And it turned out to be a very successful formula because that show lasted for many, many years, and of course we still talk about it today. But another quote that drives this home, if you remember the Randy Posh, the last lecture, quote that he gives really drove home this point, where he talks about Captain Kirk, and he says he didn't know everything about everything. Scotty knew more than him about engineering, Spock about science, and Bones about medicine. So it wasn't necessarily the smartest person in the room who was the leader, but there were some other very important characteristics having to do with emotion that seemed to be more important in this role. Now, I've had the opportunity to study many, many leaders in business and politics, in a number of different areas in sports as well. And I've got just a few examples here, but it's very consistent what you find when you study successful leaders. This is taken from Michael Dell's autobiography, where he talks about the fact that as a leader, he's always surrounded himself with the best talent he could find, because you realize when you're a leader, you can't do everything yourself. And the more talented people you have around you, the better off you and the organization will be. And typically, we find that successful leaders are really good at this. I've had an opportunity to test emotional intelligence test many, many leaders from places like the Young Presidents Organization, the Young Entrepreneurs Organization, Innovators Alliance, and a whole series of leadership organizations. And one of the things you find is the leaders who think they know it all, who can do it all by themselves. They think they're experts in accounting, experts in marketing, experts in almost everything. We find that those are kind of the most likely to fail in terms of their endeavors. And the ones who know themselves better, their strengths and their challenges, such as an example we have with Michael Dell, where he finds people to fill the gaps, they tend to be the most successful leaders. And there's many examples of this. Bill Gates has a quote very similar to that one in terms of his own operating style. I always like to pull out a Peter Drucker quote because I get to talk in business schools, and they don't really respect you there unless you have a good Peter Drucker quote. So here it is. Success in the knowledge economy comes to those who know themselves, their strengths, their values, and how best to perform. So even Peter Drucker, the guru of business management, talks about the importance of self-knowledge or self-awareness, or really knowing yourself. There's a really interesting case, and I'm probably not going to have time to go into it for this webinar, but Ginni Rometty, the first female head CEO of IBM, is a very interesting story in the world of emotional intelligence. And she was able to really climb a very male-dominated industry, and especially an organization, IBM. But one of the things that I believe really separated her, and there's a number of examples that you'll find if you research or go, her background, or even look at this Fortune magazine article about her that came out last October 2012, talking about how she was able to use both her emotions and her logic or intelligence in making things happen at IBM, and identified her for some time as someone to watch in terms of emotional intelligence really becoming front and center in the IT industry, for example, as well as a number of other industries, and how she brings it forward. So what is this emotional intelligence thing? Well, a number of us have been working at it for over 20, 25 years, but the world at large didn't really know about it or hear much about it until the first book on the topic, Daniel Goleman's book, was written up by Time magazine and was basically made a worldwide phenomenon. Here's a quote from there where they quote him as saying, "It's not about your IQ, it's not even a number, but emotional intelligence may be the best predictor of success in life, redefining what it means to be smart." Now, there might have been a bit of an overreach in that original quote that went on there, but this is the time that emotional intelligence really became known worldwide to everyone. The work some of us have been doing, we had been developing an emotional intelligence test prior to this sort of exploding on the world, and this really got it out there. This really was helpful for our work as well as a number of other people's who were working kind of quietly and unknown in the backgrounds doing our research and development. Where does it stem from, or where does it come from? Well, you're all probably familiar with the theory of evolution and Charles Darwin. What you may not know is that some of Darwin's work was considered the roots of emotional intelligence. So someone had asked, and you know, if you have questions, by the way, I should mention, feel free to type them in. Someone had asked about the time when the Time EQ article was published, and that was in the fall of 1995, I believe, that came out, September, October, I can't remember exactly. So Charles Darwin is cited as sort of one of the sources for this idea, this concept of emotional intelligence. And the idea was in a book he wrote, not as well known as his book on evolution, but a book called The Expression of Emotions. And in that book, he argued that animals, just as humans, had a variety of emotions and very similar emotions. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to look at the differences between emotions across cultures, but he was far ahead of us looking at the animal kingdom as well. And I have an example here of a drawing that was taken from his book, just showing, and this book was filled with hundreds of these drawings showing how various animals expressed emotions and felt emotions very similar to the way humans do. Now, if any of you out there have a pet, have a dog, cat, whatever, this is probably obvious to you. I mean, pet owners know this. You know when your dog is hungry or happy or sad or whatever, but those of us in the science world, I guess, you know, we're sort of slow to catch on to these things, and you always have to validate them through scientific studies. But just as an example of this concept, here's a dog taken from Darwin's book. And if you saw this dog, I wonder how many of you would be willing to just go ahead and pat him. Probably not many of you, because as you can see, the dog looks pretty angry by the expression on its face. And that, according to Darwin, the emotions serve as a signal, just as a stoplight does. It's a signal to approach or avoid. In this case, obviously, avoid. If you weren't very emotionally intelligent or emotionally smart, you'd probably go and get your hand bit off. But if you were smart enough to know that was an angry animal, then you would avoid it and stay back. So the whole idea being emotions were a signal. That's why we have them. There's a purpose for emotions. If you saw a crying child, if you're high in emotional intelligence, the chances are pretty good that you might go and comfort that child. So, so that's one of the big purposes, according to Darwin, that emotions serve. Now, Peter Salovey, is actually Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer who coined the term emotional intelligence as we know it today. Dan Goleman basically borrowed it from them and wrote the book that became the bestseller. But Peter, who's now president at Yale University, at the time that we started working with Peter, he was a professor of psychology at Yale University. But his concept in coming up with emotional intelligence was because he saw emotions as kind of an organizing process that allowed us to sort of think and behave adaptively. So if we were good at using our emotions in a difficult situation, we would, through the task, we would adapt and do well. If we were not good at it, or if we lost control of our emotions, or were completely unemotional, that may affect our performance in various tasks. And that's where this whole idea or concept started of looking at emotional intelligence. Some people use emotions really well and function well at whatever it is they do, and other people fall apart or don't use emotions very well. It's a disorganizing factor instead of an organizing factor, and it gets in the way of their functioning well. So that's kind of the basis of the concept, or at least where it started. Now, since those early days of the 90s when we were working on this, you know, it's really exploded, as I mentioned, and along with that, the ideas or the definition of emotional intelligence has exploded. There's been a number of different definitions. I don't want to get into the controversies of all the different definitions, but I just want to sort of summarize it for you, because all the different definitions, or pretty 90% of them, have these three components as part of it. So they all will say to you that being emotionally intelligent has to do with identifying emotions. And that could be identifying emotions in other people or identifying our own emotions, right? So identifying, I know basically how I'm feeling, and I can tell how you may be feeling. The second important component that's shared by all the theories is the ability to manage emotions. So people high in emotional intelligence are good at managing their own emotions, but they're also good at managing other people's emotions. Now, you may wonder about that and say, well, how can I manage somebody else's emotions? Well, you might just want to think if you have a sibling, for example, who sometimes can get on your nerves or push your buttons, then you know what I mean about how other people can affect your emotions. Now, it could sometimes be for good and sometimes not for good. But people who are high in emotional intelligence are good at self-management and also at managing other people, comforting other people. It could be a variety of different examples of it, but they can manage those emotions well. And finally, the area where a lot of the research I've been doing lately, an exciting area for me, is the ability to focus emotional energy. So I've been looking at really high performers, whether it's people in the military, people who are athletes, star CEOs. I've looked at Navy SEALs, people who are really, really good at certain tasks or functions are able to use emotions to get them to that level of excellence. And one of the areas we're looking at is how is it that certain people can really use emotions to get them to that next level. As I see a question coming up where someone asked who, in addition to Salovey, were the leaders in EI. Well, Jack Mayer and Peter Salovey together were the ones who wrote the first work that was led to the term emotional intelligence. There were a number of other key people, Reuben Bar-On, who we'll be talking about a little bit, and a few others who kind of paved the early days of emotional intelligence. But just to summarize this definition for now, if you want to walk away with something from today, if you just remember these three things and you have a good understanding of what emotional intelligence is, the ability to be aware of your own and other people's emotions, your ability to manage your own and other people's emotions, and the ability to focus emotion in order to get things done. So this is the model I mentioned, Bar-On, the original model, one of the original models of emotional intelligence. This is the most recent update of that model, 2.0, which is measured by an instrument called the Emotional Quotient Inventory, or EQI 2.0. I'm not going to be dealing really with this model today because we're going to be talking about the ISA, but I just want to present it to you as a very comprehensive, very well researched model of emotional intelligence. And you can see that there's 5 major areas: the self-perception, self-expression, the interpersonal area, decision-making, and stress management. So within those, there are, in each of those triangles, there's 3 specific areas that are measured that make up that major area. So the EQI is a very comprehensive measure of emotional intelligence, and one that it's a bit lengthier and it requires certification to use it, but it gives you a very deep understanding or a deep view of emotional intelligence and how we measure it. The ISA, the instrument that we're focusing on today, is a subset of that. It's a brief addition of that longer, more intensive inventory that we developed that doesn't require certification, that's much simpler to use, and it's really useful if you work with clients or individuals who just want to get the conversation rolling. Like, what is this emotional intelligence? What does it mean? And how do I kind of fit into it, or how do I gauge myself? Now, someone had asked the question, what's the difference between focusing and managing emotional energy? And I'm going to get to that right here in this model. As you can see in this model, there's a top and the bottom. The first area that I mentioned is perceiving, as I said earlier, which is the ability to be aware of, to understand emotions. Some of us are really good at reading and understanding emotions, and some of us are pretty oblivious to the emotions of other people. So there's a range of behavior there. The bottom part of that triangle is managing emotions, which, as I mentioned before, is the ability to manage your own or other people's emotions, which is basically to sort of control the way you express your emotions or the way you experience your emotions. You feel you're really angry right now, but you're not going to punch anybody. You're going to kind of contain your anger. That's what we refer to by managing. Now, the question had to do with what's focusing? Well, focusing are the areas that are more the green areas, the green boxes, where we actually go beyond just managing, self-management or other management of emotions, but we use emotions in a very specific way. We focus them for a specific purpose. In the first box, we see it's for making decisions. We are able to use our emotions to guide us in decision making. I'm going to go into each of these areas for the rest of this presentation, so you'll get a more in-depth view of what I'm referring to. But just for now, the ability to use emotions to guide you in decision making. Some people get overly emotional when making decisions and end up making bad decisions. Some people are trying to be completely unemotional when making decisions, and we'll talk about the implications of that. The middle box is achieving. So here you're taking specific emotions and using them to motivate yourself to get things done. And I'm going to give you some really concrete examples of this, and I'm going to give you later on some things you can do on your own to help you get things done. If you're procrastinating or just not in the mood to do something, there are ways or techniques or things you can do to change your mood to put you more into the mood to be more successful at doing things. And finally, influencing. So the ability to use your emotions to influence other people. When I speak to you, and I hope I'm clear because someone said they couldn't hear me very loudly. I'm trying using this new microphone. I can speak to you in a very dry monotone about a certain subject, and chances are you're going to get bored and maybe drift off and be not too interested. But if I show more expression in my voice and the way I talk to you, you can't see me right now, but oh great, I'm glad most of you can hear me. If you could not only hear me but see me, you know, my chances of influencing you, if I was going to sell you something or convince you of an argument, I'd be much more effective of it if I was able to use my emotions in certain ways. And I'm going to illustrate that a bit later on as well with some people who we've identified who are really good at influencing other people, convincing them of various things. So this is helpful for you to be aware of on a number of different levels. I mean, one is if you want to influence more people, but secondly, if you want to watch out when people are trying to influence you and be more in control of how you react to those influencing factors. Okay, this is just another quote, and you know, I've been picking these up over the last 20 years or so of various people in the field who are acknowledging the importance of emotional intelligence, and here especially in leadership. Warren Bennis has been very well known for his work in leadership, and he's one of the many people in the field who recognize the importance of emotional intelligence in being a successful leader. I'm going to start with an example right now, and especially a leadership example, just to illustrate a bit of these points. So I want you to imagine that you're the leader of a large organization, a very large company, and your company has just been implicated in destroying a natural environment. Okay, so you've done some huge damage somewhere to the environment where there are a lot of people around. What can you imagine would be the emotion of the locals in that area where you severely damaged their property, their environment? Very high is one of the answers. What kind of emotion, though? How do you think they'd be feeling? Outrage, shock, anger. Very good. Oh, you people are good. Yes, I've got anger here. So exactly. Oh, now everyone's got jumping into this. Great. So fear, angry, frustrated. So anger is what I'm looking for. So you do this, you're the leader, and you can see that you've created anger, outrage among the people in that area. Well, the next question is, what do you do about it? You know, how does a leader react in that situation? What are you going to do? You're going to empathize is one answer that I'm getting, which makes a lot of sense. Press release could be helpful depending on the press release. Try to control the anger. Yeah, how do you do that? Acknowledge what's going on, take swift action, apologize, find solutions to the problem, accept responsibility. Okay, whoa, the answers are flying in here. You people are great. That's good. Get a plan. Yes, probably some pretty experienced people in doing this out there. Well, let me give you a real-life example that happened not too long ago. I'm sure you're all familiar with this example, and it was Tony Hayward, who was a CEO of BP. And I'm sure many of you remember how he handled this situation. He started off okay. We're sorry for the massive disruption this has caused people. He apologized. Some of you said apologize. He said, oh, press releases. Some of you mentioned press releases. Then he went on to say, there's no one who wants this thing to be over more than I do, which, as you see, he's kind of flipping it over to his concerns as opposed to the concerns of the people. But then he really blows it by saying, but I'd like my life back, where it's just making it all about him. And as you can see in the little bottom, he went off in the middle of the crisis to a yachting race to his yacht while this stuff was all going on. So this way of handling a crisis, of sort of not reading things right emotionally, was of major cost to the organization. He lost his job. I don't think he'd be very welcome in many places in the eastern seaboard of the U.S. right now. This was very damaging for that organization and didn't go over very well. I can tell you now that there's been significant change at this organization at BP, and emotional intelligence is actually an important part of leadership training at BP. I won't say it's totally as a result of this experience, but I'm sure it has contributed to it. But just to show that there are other ways to handle it, I'll give you another example, a real-life example that happened prior to this. And again, you're the leader of a large company, and now this time your products are implicated in the deaths of several people. What emotion do you think your customers are experiencing, or potential customers are experiencing in this situation? You let them fly. Grief, panic, mistrust, anger, fear, fear, fear. Yes, you're good group. Fear, uncertainty, sadness, fear. Those of you who said fear, and there's a bunch of you out there, you got it. And you probably recognize happy to sue. Yeah, that's one of the things. But who are you suing? They didn't do it. It was implicated someone else. If you remember the Tylenol example in, I believe it was Chicago, and this is just, what do you do again? But let's jump ahead. It wasn't even their fault. You couldn't sue them because somebody had gone around to pharmacies and put some poison in some Tylenol cases. So it wasn't even their fault that it happened. But the CEO of Johnson & Johnson at the time, Jim Burke, gives an amazing example of how to handle that situation. His first response was, how do we protect the people? Even though they weren't responsible for it, they took responsibility. And the second, of course, was to save the product of the company. They didn't want Tylenol to disappear as a product. It was a huge revenue maker for them. So what did he do? He went on TV and spoke. He condemned the poisonings very clearly. If you remember seeing this, he was very emotional. He had tears in his eyes when he was being interviewed on TV, on 2020, I think it was, and several other shows. He recalled all the Tylenol. He made a change in the packaging right across the board. He added safety barriers to all the bottles. He took huge responsibility for this. And yes, if someone is just writing in right now, we handled it well and achieved both of his goals. Exactly. He handled it very well from an emotional intelligence perspective and was able to achieve his goals. He saved the product. It's still with us today. Many people don't even remember this event, but it could have been the death knell for the product. But he was able to read the audience and read it correctly and react and behave correctly. And those are all really, really powerful emotions. And that gets to this first area that we're talking about, which is the ability to perceive emotions. And that's what we measure in the ISA. That's one of the first scales that I talked about. Our ability not only to understand our own emotions, which is critical and part of it, but also stay attuned to the emotions of others. So in a situation where the people were angry versus where the people were fearful, you can see that the kinds of actions you might take may be different in terms of dealing with those kinds of emotions. The ability to demonstrate empathy, and I think some of you had mentioned empathy in your responses here. The ability to differentiate between emotions. People who are high in emotional intelligence are really good. It's not just, oh, I feel bad. They know exactly what they're feeling. You know, I'm feeling a bit upset because of something that happened to me when I was leaving the house this morning, et cetera, et cetera. They're able to read their emotions to a very fine-tuned example. Okay, how important is emotional perception? Let's talk about a research. I want to jump into the research in this area. One particular research study that I found really interesting and how it relates to leadership. You may have heard of this concept of emergent leadership. It's a big concept right now because we have a lot of teams in the workplace today where people are put together to work on a project and no leader is really necessarily appointed. We just throw them together and say, fix this, and they get together and somehow they end up doing it. And if you probably know, in most business schools, students are put together in groups and go out and solve real-world business problems. Well, this is an interesting study carried out by Stefan Cote and his colleagues at the Rotman School of Business, University of Toronto, several years ago. And it's an interesting look at this area of emergent leadership. So they took teams of MBA students who were randomly assigned to work together for a period of time, in this case 10 weeks, on real problems and real organizations. And no one is appointed as a leader, so the teams are sort of self-directed. And what he wanted to do before they were assigned was all the individuals were tested. And they were given 3 types of tests in a battery. So they were all given IQ tests, they're given personality tests, and they were given tests of emotional intelligence. And then they were randomly assigned into their groups, went off, did their projects, and at the end of it, each individual was asked to rank the leadership abilities of the members of their team. And in every team, as usually happens, someone is clearly seen as the leader. It just happens. It always happens that someone tends to be seen as the person, the take-charge person, who everyone listens to. So the idea here was trying to predict what leads to those selections. So by testing IQ, the idea being that maybe it is the smartest person in the room. Maybe the person with the most knowledge automatically gravitates to that leadership position. They're so smart that everybody just listens to them. I'm not going to do a poll right now with you because we probably don't have the time to get through all this, but as you can well imagine, that is not the person. The high IQ person was not the one that chosen as leader. So the second option was personality, the thought being that, maybe it's the extrovert. People who are really extroverted tend to talk a lot and dominate the conversation, and maybe they're seen as a leader because of that. Well, that wasn't the case either. So there's only one left, the option of emotional intelligence. And in fact, emotional intelligence was the best predictor, and this study is published if you want to follow it up. The ability to understand emotions was the best predictor of who emerged as the leader. Now that's kind of interesting because there's very few leadership programs I know of where we teach people how to understand and recognize emotions. We teach a lot of leadership skills, but we rarely teach future leaders about recognizing emotions. But when we select leaders, interestingly, maybe not even consciously, those are the people that tend to get selected as leaders. So I quickly give you all emotional intelligence test to see how good you are at recognizing emotions in people. There's a list of emotions on the left. There's some pieces on the right. And I'll give you very quickly, you can see if you can start piecing together which emotion goes to which face. Now hopefully you're going to get this right. This is an exercise I've done around the world, different cultures. I've done it in Beijing. I've done it in South America and Europe, Australia, and all through the United States and Canada. And guess what? Most people, almost all people, are really good at making this these connections of identifying. And these are pretty obvious emotions, so you get the message that I'm trying to get across here. What we often do in some of our testing when we use this kind of technique is to use some less obvious examples. So some people are really good at picking up emotions in someone's face, even when there's just a little bit of that emotion, whereas other people have great difficulty with that. Okay, some of you are putting your answers in the question box, which is fine, but we don't have to do that right now. Okay, so what do we do when we read these emotions? Well, an emotion comes up. Emotions, as you probably know, affect the way you think by directing your attention. And what we do to be more in tune with our emotions is to ask ourselves the right questions. So, you know, am I feeling angry because of what someone said? Am I feeling angry because I stubbed my toe? So really trying to understand what's behind the emotion, we can train ourselves to be much better at processing emotions and then responding. And this is some of the exercises that are in the ISA kit that help you deal with this. Just to show you that, that it's not all about what we say. This is some research that was done a number of years ago looking at verbal and nonverbal communication. When we take in information, this study done by Moravian back in 71 looked at the ways in which we take in information. So when you're presented with just the words, for example, you read something, your retention is around 7%. When you look at the difference between tone of voice, as I was using at one point earlier, a flat tone of voice with no emotion, versus a more emotional tone of voice, you retain 38% of the information. And when body language comes into play, you can actually see me moving around, which you can't see right now. You will retain even more, 55% of what I have to say. Now, when I first saw this data, I thought it was a bit questionable. I mean, can that be real? I mean, you know, does it make that much of a difference, those nonverbal cues? But then I tried to look at real-life examples where we could actually see this happening, and I went back a few years. Those of you who are at least as old as I am can remember the Kennedy-Nixon debate, presidential debate, which was the first televised presidential debate. And I'm not going to be able to ask you all. I like to usually in a room when I can see you all, ask you how many of you think Kennedy won that debate, and ask how many of you think Nixon won that debate. And I'm seeing kids today when I'm presenting with younger people don't even know what I'm talking about on this debate. So yeah, I see some of you remember it, which is good. All right, well, here it goes. This is why this was so interesting. I'm seeing a number of you are already putting in Kennedy won the debate. Kennedy won. Yeah, you would like to think that, but listen to this. When it was done among radio listeners, in other words, those people who only listened to the debate, the score was 43% felt Nixon won and 20% felt Kennedy won. However, I mentioned it was the first televised debate. The people who saw the debate, it was flipped. 28% felt Kennedy won and only 19% felt Nixon won. So, and as some of you are already jumping on here on the comments, it has a lot to do with the nonverbals. As you might, if you go back and look at the tapes, which you can find on YouTube, Kennedy looked directly at the camera, directly at the people. Nixon was kind of sweaty, was looking at Kennedy, not at the cameras. Yeah, people are remembering the sweating, and it made a huge difference. Huge difference. Nixon had a 5 o'clock shadow as well, as you can almost see on this slide. So the nonverbals can be really, really important. And in real life, when you're interacting with people, those nonverbals are going on, those vibes. So what can we do to find out what someone, what we're perceiving in someone else in a conversation? Well, one of the exercises we give in the materials is checking in. You know, like you hear someone say, "Oh, I really like that tie you're wearing," and you think it may be a flippant response. So oh, you really like it. What is it that you like about it? So we learn to question more when someone says something to try and get at what the real feeling is that's going on. So there's a number of examples in occupational groups where people who can read emotions are really successful in what they do. This is just one example in politics. This is Winston Churchill, where you can see that he talked about being able to read emotions was a big part of eventually making him successful. He wasn't that successful earlier in his career, but he was the one who recognized that war was coming and that we better do something, and was able to eventually get that message across. And there's many occupational groups, so we're not going to have time to go through them all, but you know, in film, being a director like Hitchcock, the ability to perceive what would make people squirm, like those of you who saw that famous shower scene, will remember that. Apparently, I just read in his biography that it was his wife that had a lot to do with setting up that famous shower scene. People for months were afraid to take showers after that one particular scene. So the ability to know how other people are going to feel about something is a great skill. I have Spielberg there because he's so successful because his abilities in that area. Leonardo da Vinci made the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa. Who knew? I mean, who would know that so many people, everyone in the world knows that painting, that everybody would respond to that particular painting? His ability to read these kinds of emotions. Okay, I want to jump into a situation that many of you will remember. I want to go back to December 1961, and two record executives, Mike Smith and Dick Rowe, who worked in the London office of Decca Records. They traveled to Liverpool to go see a local rock and roll band up there that they heard about. And they decided that the band had some talent, and they invited them to audition New Year's Day 1962 down in London. So the band made the trip to London, spent 2 hours playing 15 songs at the Decca Studios. And then they went home to wait for an answer about their performance. Would they get signed? And, well, they waited for weeks. They waited for a number of weeks, and they didn't hear anything. And out of great anxiety, their manager finally had the courage to phone Decca Records and to say, you know, what about it? What happened? What about our audition? And this is what he heard. These are the words. Not to mince words, Mr. Epstein, but we don't like your boys' sound, and groups are out. It was a hard day's night, as someone has written in the... Yes, this is a story, and I select this story because it was rated in as one of the worst business decisions of the last century. And I thought it was kind of interesting. What went wrong? What happened here? How did they miss this? They had a, you know, they had a chance at this and they blew it. And how did that happen? And it's an interesting story, but it boils down to the ability to use your gut in making decisions. And I want to give a few examples of where making decisions in business can be really important. And there's some people who just have this ability to make the right decisions. And of course, some people, like in that case, make the wrong decisions. You all remember a time when the Sony Walkman was the dominant force when it came to recorded music. It was like the huge force. Like nobody would even think of going up against the Walkman for recorded music. Well, almost nobody. Then this thing came along. And, you know, you'd have to be crazy to try and compete against the Walkman, but this thing came along and just knocked the socks off the Walkman. And it wasn't the first MP3 type player out there. This, the iPod had a number of, it wasn't the early adapter or the first. It sort of learned from some of the earlier ones and was able to add a number of features that just made it take off and take charge. Likewise, telephones, phones, cell phones. Nokia for years dominated the cell phone market. Almost everybody carried a Nokia phone. It was number one in that industry. How could anybody make a decision to go up and compete against such a dominant force in the marketplace? Well, clearly someone did, and that something took over the marketplace and changed phones as we know them today, at least cell phones. How do you make those decisions? What goes into those decisions? And even more interestingly, where there is no challenger, where there is no leader of the pack, coming up with something like this, an iPad, and changing the world as a result of it. And of course, as we just saw yesterday, and just prior to that. Here's a new one. How do you think that one's going to do? Very interesting. Is this watch going to take off? I just read an article in Bloomberg today where the Swiss are getting really nervous, where they've ignored this up to now, and now they're starting to realize that in 2 years, Apple could sell something like 20 to 30 million watches, which is as many Swiss watches as get sold in 1 year. So now they're starting to sweat, but it might be a little bit too late. Apple has been able to dominate these markets. What goes into that? How do those decisions get made? Well, here's just one snippet, because we have to go quickly here, but this is a quote from the late Steve Jobs. Don't let the noise of other people's opinion put out your own inner voice. And he talks about using courage, which is an emotion, to follow your heart and intuition. And Jobs was really big on this. A lot of these decisions, they weren't made by market research. If you read his biography, you'll see that he really wasn't a believer in focus groups and that he used his gut, his intuition, his emotions to make those decisions. Was he always right? No. They made mistakes with Elisa. They made mistakes with the Newton, the first pad they put out. But he talks about that too. And it all has to do with emotion. Sometimes when you innovate, you just make mistakes. It's best to admit them quickly and get on with improving your other innovations. So it's not only about using emotions to make decisions, but when you make bad decisions, knowing how to use your emotions to get past those decisions. Many examples of this, and of course Warren Buffett is known for his ability to make decisions. Here's a couple quotes of his that I really like. We simply attempt to be fearful, an emotion, when others are greedy, and to be greedy only when others are fearful. And one of my favorite Warren Buffett quotes, we believe that according the name investors to institutions that trade actively is like calling someone who repeatedly engages in one-night stands as a romantic. So emotions are important in all kinds of decision-making. And again, we have Peter Drucker to call upon here. Whenever you see a successful business, someone once made a courageous decision. A piece of research here, I'm not going to go over this in much detail, but they looked at the difference between using facts and emotions in making decisions. They randomly assigned a bunch of college students into choosing a car, choosing a car to purchase. And what they found was that they gave them these cards, and each card had a feature of a positive feature of the car. One group has said, just use the facts, just use the information, and the other group is told, go with your gut, go with your feelings. When they showed them just a few of these cards for each car, like a few features, it was easy. There was no difference between the two groups. They picked the right one with the best features. But when they showed them a large number, many features, and told them to either use logic or use emotion, the ones who made the better choices were the ones who used their emotion, not the ones who were trying to assimilate the facts. Other examples of using emotion, selection of physicians. It's becoming now much more, we just use grade point averages all the time, but more and more medical schools are seeing the importance of looking at interpersonal skills, social skills, emotional skills of applicants. Here's one really neat study about medical school applicants. After 20 years of research at Stanford University, looking at who got into medical school, looking at past the grades when you get to the interview stage. So Redelmeyer looked at hundreds of people who got into medical school at Stanford and University of Toronto, trying to look at all the variables that successfully differentiated the ones who got in versus those who didn't get in, looking just at the interviews. And the only thing he could find that made a difference was the weather, the outside weather. If it was a cloudy, rainy day, your chances of getting into medical school were reduced. None of the other factors seemed to differentiate. His conclusion was that, maybe the students don't do as well in their interviews on gloomy days. My suggestion, which is a bit different, is that maybe the interviewers are a little more blasé or difficult to deal with on those days, not so much the applicant. But we don't know. That part of the research hasn't been done. Using emotions for decisions. Here are some examples of how you break it down. We identify the problem. We look at a variety of different solutions. We pay attention to the emotion when making decisions. We don't ignore the emotion. And we see how the emotion helps guide our decision. And then we make better outcomes. These are just one of many examples of suggestions and exercises that you can do with people on learning these skills. Again, we can use positive and negative emotions to help us in making various decisions. And there's many examples of where emotions and decision-making come into play, being a purchaser, being a good poker player, being a deal maker, and it goes on, hostage negotiation, and so on. Okay, I'm going to do this quick exercise because it's fun and maybe it'll be helpful for you. I'm going to play you a little bit of music. I'm going to ask you to listen to this music and think of your feelings, and I'm going to get you to write your feelings into that little question box right after we listen to this. So for now, I want you to all to listen to this and see how it makes you feel. Okay, very good. Okay, write down your emotions. So somebody guessed who it was. Got to find out who you are. You're pretty good. Anxious, annoyed, nervous, tense, edgy, indifferent, energetic, angry, annoyed, irritated, annoyed, energized, confused, going for a run, powerful, tense. So I'm getting all these different emotions from that same piece of music. Confused, irritated, expectant, unsettled. Okay, this is great. Okay, now I want you to listen to another piece of music, and I want you to let me know how you feel. Here we go. Okay, let it rip. Let it rip. Engaged, relaxed, motivated, relaxed, adventurous, energized, 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 relaxed, calm, interested, peaceful, relaxed. Vacation. Okay, I like the tones better. All right, so we got a variety of feelings coming here, and there were some negative feelings for the first one and some positive feelings, and likewise for the second one. I would ask you ordinarily if you can recognize that somebody already guessed that the first one was AC/DC. Kudos to you. If I had a prize, I'd give it to you. And the second one, I don't know, no one's guessed that one yet, but it is, no, nobody guessing, Segovia. Why did I pick those two particular pieces of music? Because I was amazed when I read this. Nigel Short, who was a champion, British champion chess player, uses these particular pieces of music prior to a chess game. And what's particularly interested me is that he picks the specific music based on his opponent. So when he wants to be really aggressive before a match for a specific person, he'll listen to the AC/DC tune, Walk All Over You. For another type of opponent, he wants to have a different frame of mind, he'll listen to the Segovia piece, which is Bach, playing Bach, which puts him in a different mood. Now, I thought that was brilliant in terms of the idea of emotional intelligence. Because you're able to put yourself, use the music to put yourself in the mood that you need to be in. Now here's another example. I found the same thing with the U.S. Olympic swim team. If you remember the last Summer Olympics, they didn't do too badly. Jim Bauman, the psychologist for the swim team, talks about how he had each member of the team put together a playlist, and he broke their music into slow music, medium music, and very fast music. Had them learn to use the music to put their bodies in the right state of mind that they had to be in. And they used that as part of their training, and guess what? They ended up winning 31 medals. It was incredible. Anyway, I'll give you one more example of this. A lot of you are typing your experiences with music, which is great. Look at this quote. This is a writer. See if you can guess the writer. I love the way a lot of you are contributing. See if you can guess the writer. This is a writer that I saw. He recently came here to Toronto, and I went to hear him speak, and this amazed me. He says, I listen to music all the time, not when I'm composing fresh copy, but when I'm rewriting or editing. I've always got it on, and it's always turned up really loud. I have certain touchstone songs that I go back to. They drive my wife crazy, my kids, my grandchildren crazy. I'm the sort of guy who will play Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You 25 times until I discover the song was written by Dolly Parton, and then listen to the Dolly Parton version 40 times. Can you try and guess which writer, who the writer is who said that quote is from? Oh, you guys are too smart. You're guessing it. Oh, you know. Yeah, very good. Oh, my goodness. Oh, I can't believe how many of you guessed it was Stephen King. Absolutely correct. All right, and my own touch, I've written about, oh, it's written on the handout. Geez, I didn't know they got the handout before. All right, I take it back. My own little clip for the books that I've written, something that I listen to constantly when I'm writing. And as you probably know, Van Morrison, right? I love Van. And I did this in Ireland one time, and it was just great. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything I want to cover. I'll give you one more thing before we close up. Emotions that motivate. Based on 70 years of research on emotions, if you've got to motivate somebody, whether it's your kid, whether it's students, whether it's fellow workers, guess what? These emotions on the left, they don't work. You can get angry and yell at them. You can shame them, telling them what a bad person they are. You can bore them to death. You can make them feel anxious by saying they're going to get fired if they don't shape up. Or you can say it's hopeless. You can say you're never going to get ahead in this place. They don't motivate people. These three emotions motivate people. And this is a compilation. This is, someone's asking who's researched. I reviewed in my book, if you go to it, I reviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of articles on emotions. So here they are. Hope, by saying to people that I really believe in you and I think that you can get this done. Pride, you know what, this is a great organization and we're proud of the people in this organization and what they can accomplish. And I believe that you can do this. And finally, excitement. By getting excited, we can make it move. Now, someone's written in here that fear is a huge motivator, only for the short term. It can get you over the hump, but it's not a long-term solution. But we haven't got time to get into that. I think I am running out of time, so I am going to just take you to my last part here. We talk about influencing people, how important emotions are in influencing people, and a number of occupational areas where influence is important, and developing better leaders, some of the research we've done showing that emotional intelligence is critical in leadership. But I'm going to leave you with some quotes, one from Jack Welch. GE is a big user of emotional intelligence in his leadership development program, and this is post-Jack Welch's time there. But here's the quote I want to leave you with for today, that feelings are much like waves. We can't stop them from coming, but we can choose which ones to surf. And with that, I want to just hand it back to Sarah, and thank you for your attention.
All right, great. Steve, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I do wish we actually did have more time. So we unfortunately don't have time for the live Q&A, but attendees, if you would like, would you please go ahead and submit your questions now, and we will reply via email early next week with those answered questions from Stephen. And while we wait for those questions to come in, why don't I just share a little bit about the program that is the foundation of today's session. And that would be the Emotional Intelligence Skills Assessment. The facilitator set is 20% off. You can always review the set for 30 days risk-free. And you can use the coupon code WebinarEdge at checkout. The set includes the guide and the PowerPoint presentation, samples of the paper and online assessments, as well as the developmental background information. So perfect. And Steve, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and wrap this up?
I just want to thank you all. You've been an awesome audience. I can't believe the comments that are still rolling in. You guys have been great, so just thanks so much.
I know, great. We do have a number of questions coming in, and like I said, we will go ahead and send those answered questions out probably next week. So thank you for your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative.